Good day. Over the previous couple of days, the fighting in Ukraine has been conducted at extraordinary levels of intensity, or well, maybe not the fighting, but at least the movement of troops, the advances, the whirlwind advance of the Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv region, the pullback from Kharkiv region. All of this was happening at breakneck speed, and it was very difficult for someone like me trying to do a program about these events once a day to keep up with what was going on. Literally, I would do a program, and by the time it was published, a lot of the information upon which I had based the program had become superseded by events. However, since the Russian pullout from ETHEREUM, there has been a steady slowing of tempo. That may shortly change again, but for the moment, things do seem to be a lot calmer. Now, that doesn't mean that important things aren't happening. Firstly, we're getting lots of reports of Ukrainian offensives or of planned offensives in various different places around Ukraine. There was a report a few days ago that President Zelensky had ordered General Zaluzhny to redeploy the Ukrainian forces that had participated in the Kharkiv counteroffensive further west, so that they could support the Kherson counteroffensive, which he apparently wants to restart. That offensive, by the way, is at a complete stop. There's no information of any significant or indeed any Ukrainian advances in the Kherson theatre. Then we've got some reports of a major build-up of Ukrainian forces near Ugledar. This is the southern city in the city in southern Donetsk region, which is in some way connected to the fighting near Donetsk city itself. The militia, the Donetsk militia, backed by regular units of the Russian army, have been closing in on Ugledar over the last few weeks. But we got reports that the Ukrainians were transferring large numbers of troops to Ugledar. And there were some reports that the Ukrainians were clearing minefields and were looking to launch offensives, perhaps even an offensive to try and recapture Mariupol itself. An extraordinary idea, but given the events in Kharkiv region, an idea that many people took seriously, and still do, by the way. And then we got further news that the Ukrainians were thinking about launching an offensive to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And again, there was talk, including from one of the administrators of this part of Zaporozhye region, which is controlled by Russia, and Mr. Rogov, that there's been a major build-up of Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye city itself, that artillery and tanks have been moved to this area, and that there's clearly some kind of a plan to advance on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And the reason given, interestingly enough, is that Ukraine desperately needs the electric power that this nuclear power station can generate. Before the war, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, accounted for something like 20% of the electricity that Ukraine was generating. It has now been placed in sort of cold storage. It's no longer generating any electricity at all. And that means, of course, that Ukraine's electric power grid is no longer receiving the electricity that the Zaporozhye nuclear power station was providing. And this as the autumn and winter months close in. But of course, Ukraine's energy position has been made much worse by the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy network, which I discussed yesterday. By the way, there is still been no official Russian comment about those missile strikes, those Russian missile strikes on the Ukrainian energy system. That's led some people to speculate that perhaps it was Ukraine itself that was sabotaging its own power plants in order for some reason to, well, presumably gain some kind of propaganda advantage over Russia, perhaps to justify this offensive to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I think this is too fanciful. Certainly it's too fanciful for me. I think all the evidence points overwhelmingly to the energy network, the Ukrainian energy network, having been targeted by Russia. And I think that speculations that it was the Ukrainians themselves who, on the eve of winter, sabotaged their own power supplies, I think that simply doesn't make sense, at least not to me. Also, I have to say that the scale of the damage done, particularly to the Kharkiv power station, is on such a scale that I personally cannot imagine that this was done by anything else other than a missile strike. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Speculation about a Ukrainian attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. By the way, and in parenthesis, Putin and Macron had a discussion over the phone about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which so far as I can see was completely inconclusive. Anyway, that's one other possible talk about a Ukrainian offensive. The only Ukrainian offensive that has actually been taking place over the last 4 or so days is in northern Donbass, where Ukraine has been sending troops to try to recapture the town of Krasny Liman, which was captured by the Russians, or rather by the militia, back in May. Krasny Liman is an important part of the defenses for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and perhaps it's interesting that the Ukrainians are trying to recapture this place, because as we will see, news for them elsewhere on the Donbass battlefields has not been good. But anyway, so far, up to this time, all Ukrainian attempts to recapture Krasny Liman have been unsuccessful. The town is being defended by a militia unit, which, however, is one of the best and most effective units in the Donbass militia, up to the quality of a regular army unit. But apparently there's also a Russian military unit in Krasny Liman as well. Anyway, that is the only offensive that Ukraine is actually conducting at the present time. What is perhaps more interesting is that we have had a major Russian advance in Bakhmut city. I say Russian advance, though again, it's to be clear, the spearhead is this Wagner group, this group of volunteer fighters, paid fighters, backed by militia forces. There was apparently a major battle in Bakhmut city itself yesterday, when the Wagner group advanced deeper into the town, and the Ukrainians tried to launch a counterattack to dislodge them. A counterattack, by the way, which failed. And we're getting reports that the Wagner group is now steadily clearing all of the outskirts, the southern outskirts and southern suburbs of Bakhmut, as it prepares, presumably, to launch a offensive against Bakhmut itself in order to storm this town. Now, that begs the question of why or rather of how has this happened. Now, I'm hearing some reports, which of course I can't confirm, that the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv region relied to a great extent on a redeployment of Ukrainian troops who were defending Ukrainian positions in this area of Donbass, including in Bakhmut, and that these forces were then redeployed to strengthen the strike force which was deployed against Kharkiv region. Well, if that was the case, then I think that is an extremely bad trade. Every single military commentator that I have read is in agreement that Bakhmut is the linchpin of Ukrainian defences in southern and central Donbass region. If Bakhmut falls, then the entire Ukrainian defence lines in Donbass become compromised. And Donbass remains the epicenter of the war. So, taking troops away from places where they can assist in the defense of Bakhmut and redeploying them to capture a number of small towns and empty villages in Kharkiv region, which have been stripped of Russian troops over some period of time. Well, that seems to me to be prioritizing headlines over actual military events on the ground. If that is indeed what has happened, it may explain, by the way, why the Russians so far have been reacting very calmly to the events in Kharkiv city, though I will come to that shortly. Having said that, I don't know that that is the case. It's pure speculation. It's based on some rumours that I have seen. I don't know whether those rumours are true. What I can say now with confidence is that my earlier guesstimates that about the size of the Russian force that was occupying Izium and about the fact that the Russians had been withdrawing troops from Izium for some time, that has now been corroborated. I've now seen reports from various Russian sources that the force in Izium was reduced over a period of time from 10 to 15 or even 20 battalion groups to just one, which would be, by the way, around 500 or 600 men. Let's say 2,000 all told, if you include all the auxiliaries and other troops, which corresponds closely with the figure which I gave yesterday. As a small force as compared with the much larger force that had been in Izium a few months ago. And very interestingly, it seems that the Russians continue to draw down their force from Izium from the 2nd of September. There was apparently more pullbacks of more Russian troops from Izium on the 2nd of September and thereafter, even though this came after information started to circulate on the 29th of August that the Ukrainians were planning an attack in this part of Kharkiv region. So the Russians decided to cede this ground to Ukraine. I think this is now becoming irrefutable. It was done in an entirely cold-blooded way. There was no real warning or indication from the Russians that this is what they were going to do. They've still not provided any full explanation of what was happening, but clearly, by the time the Ukrainian offensive against Kharkiv region had been launched, and exactly as I suggested, a decision had already been made in Moscow to pull out of Kharkiv region. So the Ukrainians, if they have indeed, to repeat again, withdrawn troops from Bakhmut, which is very much a center of Russian military operations in order to capture what was already ceded ground in Kharkiv region, were, in my opinion, making a bad trade. I would add, and this appears to be reinforced by a rather downbeat report from the Pentagon about the nature of the fighting in Ukraine and about the achievements of the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv region. I would add that if the plan, the Ukrainian plan, presumably drawn up in Washington and London and other places, and Brussels and other places, was to encircle and destroy what was left of the ETHEREUM grouping, then the plan, that part of the plan, was unsuccessful. And what may have been the prime objective of the offensive was not achieved. Is that the case? I'm not going to say for certain, because I don't know. I don't know what was going on in the discussions between London, Brussels, Washington and Kiev, and what plans all of these people had, and what they expected to achieve from this offensive. But if that was the plan, then what they got instead was an offensive which in effect punched air. Anyway, there we go. Now, perhaps more interesting, however, over the last few hours, the most interesting development is the extraordinary silence about events in Ukraine that we are seeing in Moscow. This is not a total silence. Some Russian officials have been talking. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, tweeted that Russia might be seeking eventually Ukraine's total capitulation. The Russian Ministry of Defense has now published an update on the progress of what they continue to refer to as the special military operation. They refer to many missile and airstrikes across Ukraine. They are claiming that around 800 men were killed as a result of these airstrikes. 800 Ukrainian soldiers were killed as a result of these airstrikes, a majority of which appear to have happened in Kharkiv region. As I've said previously, I tend to accept these Russian figures, and that would suggest that Ukraine lost 800 men killed in airstrikes, perhaps more in ground fighting in places like Bakhmut city and elsewhere. It looks like Ukraine again lost at least 1,000 men killed in a single day over the last 24 hours, showing how high the cost in Ukrainian lives this offensive has been. But anyway, as is nearly always the case with these Russian Ministry of Defense reports, it told us very little about the underlying thinking, the planning that is going on in Moscow. Now, I don't know exactly what is going on in Moscow, but as I said, we get this silence from Moscow, this failure of senior Russian officials to speak about the special military operation strongly suggests to me that some sort of debate is underway in Moscow between the major policymakers about how to continue to conduct it in the future. I noticed that a number of Russian politicians, including the Russian Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov, have now come out and have said that they want to see the special military operation upgraded to a full-scale war. They want in effect full mobilization. I don't think they will get anything like that, but they are clearly pushing for an escalation. Well, we will see whether or not that is what the Russian government does decide to do. But clearly some sort of debate is going on. And even if we don't get a formal announcement, we will probably start to see some kind of decisions starting to appear, or at least the consequences of those decisions starting to trickle out over the next few hours. Well, when we do get a sense of what these decisions are, obviously I will do an updated video. It may be long, it may be soon, we shall see. In the meantime, it's now becoming increasingly clear that the EU Council meeting on Friday, the meeting of all the EU member states to try and hammer out some kind of plan on how to deal with the energy crisis, was a complete debacle. There was no agreement on any substantive point. Moreover, some proposals floated by some countries, for example, for a general cap on natural gas prices, not only encountered opposition from some EU member states, but it infuriated Norway, which, as well, alongside Russia, is one of the major exporters of gas to the European Union. Other European states were apparently exasperated that in the middle of this energy crisis, Germany has apparently decided to stick by its decision of closing its 3 remaining nuclear power stations by the end of the year. So there was apparently an enormous amount of dissension, no substantive agreement about what to do or the way forward, and we've had instead criticisms, implicit criticisms from people like the Prime Minister of Belgium, who said that the European Union only has a few weeks to sort things out, to turn things round, after which an unstoppable spiral of deindustrialization could start to take place. Well, one almost gets the sense of European leaders acting like rabbits caught in the headlights of the proverbial car. They've made a whole series of decisions extending all the way back to February to launch an economic war. It hasn't turned out at all as they've expected, and they don't really seem to know quite what to do in a situation in which none of them expected to be. I would add that this contrasts with a parallel meeting that has just taken place in Moscow between Putin and the economic leadership of his government. There, by contrast, there was lots of discussions about how to deal with the economic problems, and overall the view seemed to be upbeat and confident. Inflation is falling fast. Prices are actually falling in Russia. And the expectation now is that the GDP contraction this year will be limited to 2% of GDP. Now, that's not, by the way, a small contraction. In other situations, it will be considered quite a serious recession. But in these kind of conditions, the kind of conditions which we are seeing at the moment, the Russians at least seem to be confident that the situation economically for them is quite stable. The contrast between what everybody expected at the start of the year and the situation we have now is remarkable. At the start of the year, back in February, when Putin declared the special military operation, the overwhelming consensus amongst most people, including myself, was that the war would be over quickly, but that the economic crisis would impact primarily on Russia, and that Russia would be faced with a major economic implosion. About that, by the way, I was skeptical. Well, the war has gone on much longer than I think practically everybody expected, myself included. Largely, I would reiterate, as I've discussed in previous programs, because of this curious conception of the special military operation that Putin has come up with. But the economic side of the conflict has turned out also completely differently from what everybody expected. Instead of Russia facing some great economic contraction, it is Europe which initiated the economic war that now looks as if it's in serious trouble. Well, there are even reports that the US government is now starting to worry about the situation in Europe. They're worried, no doubt, that an economic implosion in Europe will feed back into the United States, where, to be clear, things are not especially good either. And of course, there's also the worry that an economic implosion in Europe might result in political instability there, and perhaps a questioning of the direction that has been taken since the start of that war, that conflict in February. Well, we shall see. But anyway, that seems to me to be where we are at the moment in terms of the conflict over Ukraine. It's not the only conflict. Over the last few hours, there's been a major flare-up of fighting again between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Armenian government now looks set to make a formal request to Russia and the Collective Security Treaty Organization for help in deterring what Armenia says is Azerbaijani aggression. The Russian and Armenian defense ministers have had a telephone conversation, and Putin and Pashinyan, Armenia's prime minister, are in regular contact with each other. The very last information I've got is that there was some sort of ceasefire agreement, but we've had many ceasefire agreements hammered out over the course of this conflict, and a few of them have stuck. It's highly likely that Azerbaijan is trying to take advantage of what it sees as Russia's focus on the Ukrainian issue to try to press, to take advantage of that in order to try to capture more territory from Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh and other places. And it could very well be that one reason for this silence in Moscow is that Russian decision makers are now having to give time to the situation in the southern Caucasus as opposed to the situation in Ukraine, though I have to say I doubt that that is in fact the case. Well, we will see what the Russians do about that too. But the events in the Caucasus are a reminder that Ukraine is not the only conflict in the world. It's not the only conflict that involves Russia. And by the way, just as Macron is busy talking to Putin over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, he's also busy talking to Pashinyan over the conflict in the Caucasus. And France has tended to be very supportive of Armenia, and it could be quite curious if the Russians do decide to respond to Armenia's call for support. We could even find a situation where Russia and France, at loggerheads over Ukraine, are working together over the crisis in the southern Caucasus, all of which is entirely possible, but we shall see. Then there's further reports that the at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Samarkand, where Putin and Xi Jinping are due to have a meeting, Iran will formally be admitted to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. A big move, and one which might be preparatory to more things. And we've had, by the way, the first tentative signs that Iranian drones might indeed be present in the Donbass, in the Ukraine conflict. I've seen photos of what purport to be Iranian kamikaze drones, which were used presumably by the Russians to attack Ukrainian forces in the Ukrainian-controlled western part of the town of Kupiansk in Kharkiv region. So maybe, just maybe, these stories about Ukrainian drones heading towards Russia will turn out to be true. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, that seems to me the situation at the moment. The big thing that we're all waiting for now is to see what the Russians are going to do, what decisions Moscow makes over the next few days. If Russian forces or pro-Russian forces, the Wagner group, does indeed make major advances in Bakhmut city, if Bakhmut city is indeed about to fall, then be under no doubt that all the indications, all the expert opinions have suggested to me would be a strategic game changer in the battle for Donbass. Anyway, I will keep you informed about current developments. That's me for the day. As I said, it's quite likely that more things will have happened by the time I do my next program. But in the meantime, this is where today I'm going to stop. Remember, you can find this video together with all our other videos on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute and Telegram. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.